Everything you've ever been taught about a fire keeping you safe at night is the exact same thing that destroyed 4 families in less than an hour on ground flat enough to see for 20 miles. Dakota Territory, autumn of 1873. I want you to picture this with me, neighbor, because you need to see it before I tell you the rest. 10 wagons stopped on open ground before the light went. The men built the fire the way their fathers back east had shown them. High, wide, close to the wagons, close to the animals, good and bright. The kind of fire that makes a tired man feel like nothing out there can touch him. By morning, 4 of those wagons were ash. 2 families were walking east on foot with nothing but what they were wearing. Not wolves, neighbor. Not the cold. The very fire they built to keep themselves safe is the reason those families never saw Missouri again. Picture what that morning looked like when the sun finally crawled over the edge of that flat sky. Imagine those men standing in the gray light, coughing up black soot, looking at iron wagon wheels, sitting plain in a bed of white powder where their whole lives had been stored 12 hours before. Iron pots warped by the heat. A woman's brass thimble melted into a lump of gray lead in the dirt. And the most terrifying part of it all, neighbor, wasn't what was destroyed. It was the pattern of the burn. There were no tracks coming in from the dark, no signs of an ambush, no arrows, no wild animals. The scorch marks didn't run from the horizon inward. They started right in the middle of their own ring, right at the edge of the pit where those men had piled oak logs 3 feet high the night before. They stood there, looking at each other, realizing the truth in the cold light. The enemy hadn't crept up on them from 40 miles away. They had invited it in, built it a house, and fed it until it ate everything they owned. And here is what sits heavy with me every time I tell this one. The people who could have told them exactly what to do differently had been living on that same grass for 300 years. Nobody on that wagon train ever sat down and asked them. And I don't think anybody who knew was ever given the chance to teach. So before I go any further, I want you to ask yourself something. If you had pulled up on that same open ground, same wind at your back, same cold coming on, would you have built that fire too? Be honest with yourself. Most people would have. My name is Running Bear Walker, 54 years old. Eastern Band Cherokee, born in the Smoky Mountains, raised on the ridge my grandfather Thomas Walker refused to leave when the government came asking. Now, I'll tell you straight, neighbor. I am not Lakota. I am not Dakota. This is not my people's ground. What I'm about to hand you, I learned the same way I learn everything I bring you here. Sitting with my grandfather's journal, sitting with elders who were kind enough to talk to a Cherokee man about ground that wasn't his, and going back to whatever record still holds the truth of it, I put it together carefully. The way my grandfather taught me to put together anything that matters. Stay with me a while. You're going to want to hear this one all the way through. Let me tell you something about that ground, because it changes everything about how you should think about fire. You know the mountains, don't you? Even if you've never set foot in the Smokies, you know what a mountain does for you at night. The ridges wrap around you. The trees eat the wind before it ever reaches your skin. The ground holds water, holds cold, doesn't want to catch. The plains give you none of that kindness. Flat as a table in every direction, grass gone dry as kindling by autumn, and a wind that gets under your clothes and stays there until your bones ache. Weeks at a time, neighbor, not a passing gust. So a fire built out there, built the way you'd build one back home under cover of trees, isn't just a fire anymore. It's a signal. 15, 20 miles out on a clear night, somebody can watch that glow climbing the sky like a second sunset that refuses to go down. Now here's a thing my grandfather taught me that took me years to really understand, neighbor. Out on ground like that, in that kind of dark, your eyes do something strange to you. There's no tree line to judge distance against, no ridge to tell you how far a light is really traveling. A small fire 200 yards off can look close enough to touch, and a fire built tall enough to feel safe can throw a glow that looks like it's holding the whole night back, when really all it's doing is blinding you to everything past the edge of it. My grandfather used to say the mountain teaches a man to read the dark. You learn what moves in it, what sits still in it, what the shapes mean once your eyes settle. But a big fire doesn't let you read anything. It just blinds you to the 50 feet past the light and convinces you that's the whole world. He never said it was about being scared of the night, neighbor. He said the trouble starts the moment a man tries to scare the night away instead of learning to read it. Those settlers weren't wrong to want light. They were wrong about what that light was actually doing for them out there. Now the people who lived out here, the Dakota, nations that knew this dirt long before a wagon wheel ever cut into it, they knew something in their bones that those settlers hadn't had time to learn yet. They didn't build a fire the way you'd build one in the woods. They built it low, small, and plenty of nights they didn't put a flame on the surface of that ground at all. I want you to understand, this wasn't some old superstition passed down for its own sake. This was people who'd watched what that wind and that grass could do and adjusted generation after generation until the adjustment became instinct. A fire sitting out in the open loses most of its heat going straight up into nothing. That same wind that's chilling you steals the rest sideways before it reaches your hands, so you're burning through wood twice as fast for half the warmth, and on top of that, you've told every hungry thing downwind exactly where you're sitting. And there was a second danger, one that had nothing to do with who might be watching you, the grass itself. Come late summer into autumn, that grass across Nebraska territory, Dakota territory, the whole stretch of that country, dries out until it's closer to gunpowder than to plant. I've gone back through what old-timers and travelers wrote about that ground, and the same thing comes up again and again. It wasn't lightning that started most of those runaway prairie fires. It was a careless campfire. Somebody's careless campfire, more often than anything else you could name. You see, neighbor, most folks think a fire only travels where you can see the flame jumping, but that's not how prairie grass works. Late in the season, the mat of dead roots under that grass forms a dense, peaty layer, 2 or 3 inches deep beneath the soil. Build a heavy surface fire on top of that ground, and the intense heat bakes the earth until the soil itself dries out, and those buried roots begin to smolder. You can pour a bucket of precious drinking water on the embers, see the steam rise, walk away thinking you've done your job, and go to sleep. But down beneath the surface, 6 inches underground, a ember is crawling along that root bed like a slow fuse. It travels quiet, invisible, traveling away from your camp while you rest. And later, 2 hours later, 10 feet away from where you poured that water, that underground heat hits a dry clump of needle and thread grass poking out of the dirt. A gust of wind catches it, supplies the oxygen, and in 2 seconds you don't have a campfire anymore. You have a wall of fire 10 feet high, running at 20 miles an hour. My grandfather, Thomas, used to do something that looked plain crazy to people who didn't know better. Before he'd ever let us strike a match near dry brush, he'd kneel down, pull back the surface grass, and press the flat of his bare palm hard against the dirt for 10 seconds. If his palm came up cool and damp, the ground could take a coal. If his palm came up dry and dusty, he'd look at me and say, "Thomas, this earth is thirsty. Anything you put on top of it, it's going to swallow and carry somewhere you can't reach. That simple touch, bare skin to dirt, saved more camps than 100 pails of water ever could. The settlers pushing west just didn't know that yet, neighbor. Most of them had never once stood on ground that ran flat to the horizon in every direction they looked. They came from country with trees to cut that wind, rivers close enough to matter if things went wrong. They built the only fire they knew how to build, and that fire punished them harder out there than almost anywhere else on this whole continent. The people who already called that ground home had already paid for that lesson a long time before. Nobody thought to ask them what they knew. So let me walk you through what they did instead, piece by piece, the way my grandfather would have walked me through it, squatting down in the dirt with a stick, making sure I understood each part before he gave me the next one. Now, the first thing they did was so simple, it's almost hard to believe, neighbor. Instead of building on top of the ground, they went down into it. A narrow pit, sometimes no bigger around than a cooking pot. And off to the side, a few feet away, a second smaller tunnel dug at an angle, meeting up with the bottom of that pit. That side tunnel isn't just a hole, neighbor. That's a bellows. Hot air rises straight up out of the main pit, and as it does, it pulls fresh air in through that side tunnel behind it. You end up with a fire that burns hotter than almost anything you could build sitting out on open ground, on a fraction of the wood. Get down close to one of these when it's drawing right, and you'll hear it before you understand it, neighbor. A low pull, steady, almost like the ground itself is breathing, air dropping down that side tunnel and rising back up through the coals over and over, without a single gust of wind ever touching the flame directly. My grandfather used to crouch by a hole like that and just listen a minute before he said a word. He called it borrowing the earth's breath instead of fighting the skies. And that's really the heart of the difference, if you want to understand any of this. A tall fire out in the open is a man trying to bend the land to his comfort, burn it bright, burn it big, make the dark back off. A fire in a hole is the opposite kind of thinking entirely. You're not fighting that ground, neighbor. You're working with what it already wants to do. The very wind that would have torn a surface fire apart becomes the thing feeding this one once you stop trying to overpower it and start listening to which way it's already moving. Sit with what that solves for a second. A hotter fire on less fuel means less time spent hunting for wood on ground where there's barely any to find. It means your flame sits below the sight line of the grass around you, invisible past a few hundred feet, where a surface fire would have lit up the whole horizon. And it means the wind that would have torn a regular fire apart in minutes can't touch this one, because the earth is shielding it on every side. Then there's what went inside that hole. Out there, timber was so scarce that whole wagon trains went days without a proper stick of firewood. But the people who lived there had already solved that problem long before any of those wagons showed up. Dried buffalo dung, what the settlers would come to call buffalo chips. I know how that sounds to modern ears, neighbor, but out there, it was gold. Dry it in the sun, and it catches easy, burns hot, and gives off almost no smoke at all. Not that slow, low smolder that hangs over your camp and marks exactly where you are for a mile in every direction. A clean burn, quiet, nearly invisible. Now the settlers did eventually pick this up too. Most every wagon train crossing those trails came to depend on buffalo chips just as much as the people who taught them, because out there simply wasn't anything else to burn. But learning what to burn is only half of it, neighbor. Learning how to build the fire itself, low, sheltered, controlled, that half took a lot longer to cross over. And it's the half that cost people the most, And you couldn't just dig anywhere either. Not just any flat stretch would do. Low ground, a shallow dip, the curve of a dry creek bed, the downwind side of a rise where the worst of the gusts passed overhead instead of through camp. That placement was doing the same job trees would have done back east, except there weren't any trees left to lean on out there. Then there's the part that's easiest to miss, and the hardest to unlearn once somebody points it out to you, neighbor: restraint. That fire went up to do a job, cook the meal, warm the hands, boil the water, and then it was let go, not fed all night into some blaze meant to keep burning till sunrise. A small fire, tended close, an hour at a time, does more work and does it safer than a big one left roaring while everybody sleeps. Put those four together: the hole, the fuel, the ground you choose, and the discipline to let it go, and you've got something that looks almost nothing like what those 10 wagons built that night in 1873. And that difference, neighbor, that's the whole reason some people walked away from nights like that one, and some people didn't. Now here's the part I really need you to sit with, because most folks get it backwards, and I understand why. A tall fire, roaring away, feels safer. That's not you being foolish. That's just how we're built. Heat on your skin, light pushing the dark back, that crackle and pop working on something old in us. Every tired, cold body reads that fire as protection. But feeling safe and being safe are two very different things. And out on that open ground, that gap between the two is exactly where people lost everything. We have this deep, ancient fear of the dark sitting in the back of our brains. Neighbor, it's been there since we were sleeping in caves, listening to things moving in the brush that had bigger teeth than we did. When a man gets tired, cold, and uncertain, his instinct isn't to think clearly. His instinct is to push the dark back as far as he can. He wants a giant ring of light so he can see what's coming. But here's the trap that most folks never realize until it's too late. When you build a blaze so big that it blinds you to everything outside its ring, you haven't conquered the night. You've just traded real security for a cozy illusion. You've made yourself completely visible to everything in the dark, while making yourself completely blind to whatever is standing just 10 feet outside the light. True safety out on open ground doesn't come from making noise or throwing light. It comes from quietness. It comes from tuning your ears to the rustle of the grass, letting your pupils open up until you can see the shapes of the hills under the starlight, and moving with the landscape instead of trying to light it up like a theater stage. The settlers wanted to feel like they were back in Ohio in a log cabin with a roaring hearth. But they weren't in Ohio. They were on the high plains, and the land doesn't care about your comfort. It only cares whether you respect the rules it set down 10,000 years before you got there. A fire sitting out in the open does 3 things a hole in the ground never will. It throws light for miles across country with nothing to stop it. It burns most of its heat straight up and away from you. So what you're feeling is only a piece of what you're burning, and it sits right down at grass level, one hard gust away from touching off ground that's been drying since July. None of that touches a fire built down in the earth. The light stays below the rim of the pit. The heat gets pulled along the ground toward you instead of straight up into the sky, which is exactly why a hole like this can warm you better than a fire 3 times its size sitting in the open. And because that flame never once touches grass at ground level, the biggest danger on that whole landscape, fire jumping into dry grass and outrunning everybody near it, is nearly gone. That's what those 10 wagons didn't have, neighbor. Not some secret being kept from them on purpose. Just knowledge that belonged to people nobody on that train had ever once sat down with. The wind came up sometime after midnight, the way it does on that ground most nights come autumn. A spark rode it into grass dry as paper, and by the time anybody woke to the smell of it, that fire was already moving faster than a man can run. 4 wagons and everything inside them, gone before the hour was out. Not because that land is cruel to people, because a fire built like you'd build one in Ohio has no business on ground like that, and nobody ever told them so. So let's put the whole thing together plain, the way my grandfather laid it out for me, in the dirt so I couldn't forget it. Dig low, feed air, burn clean, stay small. That's the whole method, neighbor. 4 pieces, 4 words apiece, and every one of them earned by people who lived on that ground long enough to know exactly what it would forgive and what it wouldn't. Here's what I want you to try this weekend. If you've got a yard, a fire pit, or a stretch of open ground where a small fire is legal and safe, dig 2 holes. Main pit, about 1 foot across, 1 foot deep. Second hole, narrower, angled down into the base of that pit from about 1 foot away. Upwind, if you can manage it. Light a small fire in the main pit, and just watch. Watch what draw through the side tunnel does to your flame. Watch how little smoke comes off it once it gets going. Watch how much heat comes back into your hands compared to the size of fire you actually built. You're going to feel that difference before I ever need to explain it to you in words. And once you feel it, neighbor, you'll understand something those 10 wagons never got the chance to learn. Now let me tell you the truth sitting underneath all of this, because it's bigger than fire. Whoever sells you that big steel fire pit, that shiny lantern, they aren't selling you safety, not one bit. They're selling you the feeling of it, the same feeling that cost those settlers everything back in 1873. There's no money in teaching a family to dig a foot-deep hole and burn less wood for more heat. There's good money in selling that family a bigger pit, more wood, a brighter lantern, and the comfort of believing bigger always means safer. And I think about that trade a lot, neighbor. What we gave up for what we got. My grandfather's generation carried a hole in the ground, a pouch of dried chips, and 100 years of paying attention. And none of that cost $1. None of it needed a receipt. What we carry now needs a truck to haul it, a card to pay for it, and it still doesn't teach us one single thing about the ground we're actually standing on. We traded knowledge that lived in a person for equipment that lives in a box, and somewhere in that trade, we stopped asking whether the box kept us any safer at all, or just kept us comfortable enough not to ask. A bright light and a big flame will always feel like more protection than a quiet hole in the dirt. Feeling is easy to sell, neighbor. Knowing what actually works took generations to earn, and it never once came with a warranty. That's not some conspiracy, neighbor. That's just how markets work, but it means the knowledge that would have kept you warmer, quieter, and a whole lot safer out on open ground was never going to be the knowledge somebody put a price tag on. It was always going to be the knowledge some grandfather carried, and only handed down if somebody cared enough to sit and ask him. My grandfather Thomas carried 100 pieces like this one in that leather journal of his. I can see that book in my mind right now as plain as if it were sitting on the table between us. Dark deer-hide cover, worn smooth at the corners where his hands held it for 40 years, held together by a strip of rawhide wrapped 3 times around the middle. When you open it, the pages smell like cured wood smoke, pine resin, and old paper. He didn't write in it with fancy ink, neighbor. He used an old lead carpenter's pencil, pressing hard into the grain of the paper so the letters stayed legible, even if the pages got damp. He drew tiny, precise diagrams in the margins, the exact angle to cut a spring pole for a deadfall trap, the way a river bend cuts into bank clay during a spring flood. and 2 neat circle sketches right on page 42 showing this exact fire pit with arrows drawn in faded lead, showing where the air enters and where the heat settles. He didn't write those pages because he figured the world was coming to an end, or because he wanted to be famous neighbor. He wrote them in the 1920s and 30s because he looked around him and saw roads being paved through the mountains, saw electric lines being strung across ridges, and realized how fast 1,000 years of hard-earned human wisdom can evaporate in just 2 generations once people decide that buying a solution is easier than learning one. He knew that the moment a man forgets how to dig a hole to warm his hands, he becomes completely dependent on whoever owns the store down the road. He wrote it all down hand to hand, passing that leather book to me on the porch when my hands were finally big enough to hold it, making me promise I wouldn't just read the words, but that I'd go out into the dirt and test them until they lived in my fingers, not just in my head. The people who worked this out, nothing but earth, wind, and generations of paying attention to what actually worked. They never wrote it into a book that made it to your schoolroom. It lived hand to hand, same as my grandfather's journal made it to me. That's what I'm handing back to you tonight, neighbor. Not because I think the world's ending tomorrow, because it's worth having, and because somebody, somewhere, never got the chance to pass it down to you the way it should have been passed. Have you ever seen an old-timer build a fire this way? Or did nobody ever pass that down to you? Tell me in the comments, neighbor, because the story that pulls the most of you in is the one I go deep on next. Hit subscribe if you're new here. Not for me. For the knowledge we keep pulling back into the light on this channel. You're going to want to be here for the next one. Next time, the water method the Cherokee used in these same Smoky Mountains, and the mistake that killed more settlers in these hills than drought ever did.